day. Today we will have in this panel session, we will specifically look at developments, challenges, and opportunities for infrastructure development in Africa. Now, before I get to just quickly introduce myself, I've just been asked to just remind everyone to make use of the chat box for any questions during the presentation as well. Just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Wilco de Villiers from the Synergy team. I'm part of DRA Global. I'm an electrical engineer and I've been heavily involved in power and energy projects in the region for quite some time now. Today we have a very strong group of panelists taking part in this discussion. And this topic is very close to my heart, so I'm really looking forward to learning as much as possible from each and every one of you. So just to quickly go through, and I will go back to this for each and everyone to introduce themselves. We will have Anita Otobu, Tim Kerkhoff, Ashwin West, Scott Alexander, as well as Dr. Pillay, part of the discussion. But let's just quickly go back to the topic. Infrastructure has always been a challenge in sub-Saharan Africa. When we talk about infrastructure, we refer to transport, communication, power, and water. Without it, we struggle to improve our economic activity, efficiencies, and competitiveness. Development finance and private investment is often needed to expedite development and projects. But there are many other factors needed to support infrastructure development, such as investment, industrialization, skills development, regional integration, just to name a few. But critically, successful projects need an enabling environment. So as promised earlier, and Anita, I'm going to start off with you. It would be great if each and everyone can just quickly introduce yourself, as well as give us a bit of a background on this topic and what you are seeing in this environment. And it would be great if you have a case study or two as well. I've roughly allowed 20 minutes for this, so let's make it 4 to 5 minutes per panelist, please. Anita?
Thank you. So my name is Anita Otobu once again, and I'm head of the Program Management Unit for the Nigeria Electrification Project, which is essentially a program funded by the World Bank and the African Development Bank for a total of $550 million US. It's been implemented by the Rural Electrification Agency. I'm also a member of the advisory board for SC4All, Sustainable Energy for All's Universal Energy Facility. So essentially today, as we speak about infrastructure, I will be focused more on the power space. So infrastructure that provides for access to power supply and what we do under the Nigeria Electrification Project and the Universal Energy Facility. Thank you.
Good. Thanks a lot, Anita. Tim?
Hi, I'm Tim. As an infrastructure analyst with Fitch Solutions, I identify and analyze infrastructure trends in the region, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, with a particular focus on what opportunities and risks are there for our clients. And looking at infrastructure development in the region, largely government strategy should respond or be shaped by the profile and quality of the infrastructure project pipeline, and here we see as the best kind of enabling factor generally robust revenue profile for individual projects. We see this particularly in the freight infrastructure sector. We often have a good demand outlook, and examples that you asked for include DP World's expansion of Berbera Port, for instance, in the Horn of Africa, where we see sustained demand for imports and exports to and from Ethiopia. We see in Tanzania, the Standard Gauge Railway, which is being developed with both private and development financing. It involves a diverse kind of range of contractors, including Chapi McKinsey, Portuguese Matango, and Chinese contractors as well. We see this in Nigeria as well, where we see kind of a railway project between Niger and Nigeria supported by financing organized by KfW IPAX, as well as Credit Suisse and the Africa Finance Corporation, and again supported by an intra-regional trade outlook that supports the revenue profile of this project. Thanks. Just going to pass on there.
Thanks, Tim. Ashwin, please.
Thanks, Wilco. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ashwin West. I'm an investment director at African Infrastructure Investment Managers. We are a private equity fund management business deploying equity on the continent. We invest across the full suite of core infrastructure. So, of course, today's panel is very much what we focus on, looking at challenges and opportunities. My personal interest and an area of expertise is within the energy sector. So, similar to Anita, I've invested in the off-grid energy sector, renewable energy, as well as thermal energy. So, yeah, very happy to talk and share some of the experiences that we've had and some ideas around challenges and opportunities with a bit of an energy sector lens. Thanks, Wilco.
Thanks, Ashwin. Scott, please.
Thanks, Wilco. My name is Scott Alexander. I'm the Vice President of DRA Nexus, and we primarily focus on the business resilience and lifecycle solutions, largely where the private or industrial sector meets our host communities and governments. So the large focus of the DRA Nexus part of the DRA group is around the environmental, social governance, and also water treatment, and specifically expanding into finance solutions in the water space. And one of the big things that I'm quite excited about is where we link the strategies and structures that we're going to talk about today with the people and cultures to actually make them work. So the ESG is a very common term that is used and often evaluated in three distinct components. And what we found as a very opening model is to look at how those three aspects integrate together in a stakeholder inclusive way that goes beyond just the business and government and includes those the community and the environment aspect. So combining all of those interests is what unlocks the creative solutions on how to mutually benefit.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Dr. Pillay?
Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Morgan Pillay. I'm the Senior Finance and Infrastructure Advisor, seconded from GIZ to the African Union Development Agency. And part of my responsibility is to provide advice on the PIDA program for Africa. And as you know, that program focuses on ITC, water, energy, and transportation. My background is in development finance, so I've spent almost 30 years in that environment, both local and international projects. But I think my interest lies in the nexus between the climate, economic, and the infrastructure that we're talking about. How do these things come together and work together so that the investments become a realizable one? An important shift recently has also been the shift towards climate resilience and proofing, and much of the money seems to be coming from there internationally. So therefore, I think Africa has to respond to that appropriately. And I think lastly, I'm very passionate about good project preparation, particularly in the early stages. I'm of the view that good projects that are well prepared will find the financing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. So at least everybody has now been introduced, and now I think it's clear why I've said earlier that I'm excited about this opportunity to have so many experts part of this discussion, and why I'm looking forward to learning a little bit more about this. So if we look at this, there's obviously a whole host of things that we can discuss. But what I'm interested in, let's start off just to improve things a bit later. Let's start off initially on the negative side of things. What challenges do you see? And it would be great if we can just quickly run this through the whole panel. But what challenges do you see that that's a threat to successful infrastructure projects and their completion. And how do we mitigate these risks? Dr. Pillay, just to swap things around, can we start off with you, please?
Yeah, sure. I think in 2014, in the Dhaka Financing Summit, a number of risks were raised in terms of African projects. One was project preparation, particularly the early stage. The outer NEPAD went forward and structured the service delivery mechanism, which I can say in the last 3 years have produced at least 15 projects that have received some advisory services and are now able to move to the next stage. It also has been quite instrumental in developing what is now called the PDAP quality label. So meaning that some level of quality is certified by the African Union Development Agency. And this has also been recognized by some of the infrastructure project financiers on the continent. I think the second challenge relates to providing comfort to some of the private investors, and the move towards setting up a guarantee mechanism has been slow, but a co-guarantee platform has been set up. I suspect that because of its partial guarantee, services, it does not provide a full suite of security instruments at this stage, and that will need to be expanded. And I think the big opportunity for me lies in what I said earlier about climate change and to what extent Africa can get a strategy together with using some of the corridors within the African continent and trying to stack up these investments so that it starts to make economic sense. And I think the challenge is going to be, how do we package these projects and stack them up so that when private equity investors or the DFIs come on board, they are able to see the kind of long-term returns in these projects. And I think some of the projects suffer from these because you can't see the economic linkages that are necessary for the infrastructure to work. And the last point I want to make is there's an increasing trend now towards localized projects where you have smaller communities where I think climate proofing is going to play a big role. And I think getting the strategies and the planning together with governments are going to be a critical component, because I think many of the international climate financiers are looking at those types of projects and how they could make a long-term change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Scott, on your side?
I think one of the pieces that Dr. Pillay mentioned was the guarantee instruments, which are evolving in the ecosystem that we're operating in. And from my perspective, those guarantee instruments, it's a formalization of trust between the stakeholders. And one of the challenges that we experience, especially in infrastructure where the life cycle of the opportunity can be 20 years or even 50 years in some of these aspects, is the need to have that trust and the trust to change together as the opportunity evolves. So a static arrangement which remains fixed for 50 years doesn't have the ability to evolve and grow. And there's a quote from I'm sure I'll butcher it, but no battle plan survives first contact. And things change, we adapt, and we need the ability to do that together. So with the governance aspect of the frameworks that we're operating in, there's an expanding focus on scenario planning across the full life cycle. And that scenario planning is expanded into the decision support and prescriptive analytics, and allowing all of the stakeholders to mobilize trust together to change and evolve in step with the opportunities that they're working towards. So I think one of the challenges is static agreements that don't allow the members to mobilize that trust to evolve. And that's also one of the big opportunities to do that with between the governments and communities and the private industry, to move together rather than be stuck with our feet in the past.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Ashwin, anything you would like to add?
Thanks, Wilco. I guess Morgan and Scott have already touched on many of the key points already. The joy of being first. So I'd like to perhaps supplement something that Morgan said with an interesting stat I read recently, which is probably 2 or 3 years out of date, but I think still applicable. I read that this is from a McKinsey report. They had noted that something like only 20% of projects get from concept stage to feasibility. And then at that point, only 50% actually make it from feasibility all the way to financial close. So in other words, only 10% of projects go from concept to actually to achieving financial close. So, with that in mind, from our perspective, we always note that there is lots of capital available to pursue projects on the continent. We are not capital constrained. There are insufficient investment opportunities. That is the problem. Now, Morgan's already touched on something, which is the project preparation facilities, and that comes back to poor quality feasibility work undertaken by developers. And often it's a lack of skills, it's a lack of resourcing, and often a lack of funding. That's where obviously the project preparation facilities come in. So we definitely see that as being one of the key challenges. The next one I think I'd like to touch on, which hasn't been touched on yet, is around risk allocation. And so, we often see that projects fail because of an inability to allocate risk to the party who is best placed to actually manage that risk. And here we're talking about private sector versus, the public sector. And that is what we often see as a major hurdle for projects to get to that point of financial close, even if they've been lucky enough to get to a point of feasibility or passing the feasibility stage. So definitely that the risk allocation and how to manage that is a real challenge. And I think later on we can talk about some of the mitigants around that, but let me leave it at that for now.
Thanks a lot, Ashwin. Yes, I know it's terrible if you ask one question to the same group and then suddenly the last two people, they have to repeat whatever's been said. Sorry about that. So Tim, on that note, that's your turn, man.
I'll give it a try to say something new. We're kind of tying back to what I said earlier that obviously project completion risk is much more positive the more robust the revenue profile is of a given project. And I think here we see that in the region, revenue risks increase, the more dependent revenues will be on the consumer rather than, say, for instance, a private operator that operates in the freight infrastructure space. So, and this will impact particularly projects in the water sector, projects in the energy sector as well. But we've seen here that, as previously mentioned, guarantees can serve to mitigate those risks. So in the energy sector, for instance, mitigating off-taker risks. So for instance, in 2019, the World Bank launched its renewable guarantees program, from which we've already seen a 100 megawatt solar power project in Ethiopia benefiting. And then this is obviously something that can significantly de-risk a project and mitigate those revenue risks. Other risks, obviously, political risks that are particularly pertinent in the region. Here again, we see guarantees coming into place as a mitigant. But I think very importantly, we can point also to the positive policy track record that we do see in many countries, like in Uganda's energy sector. We've had reforms, unbundling of the utility, we had a Get Fit program, all of which in the long run have been able to support investor confidence, or comfort, I believe, as it's been called earlier. I'm going to stop here. That's on. Thanks.
Anita?
So I think most, if not all, of the panels have touched on the issue of funding, access to funding being a challenge to infrastructure development. And towards securing such funding, at least for private sector, there needs to be that enabling environment. There needs to be the legal framework. So a number of African countries unfortunately don't have the relevant laws or regulations in place that will either promote or ensure the protection of private sector investment. And this can obviously be a challenge for securing the necessary funding for infrastructure projects. With Nigeria, speaking from the power sector perspective, fortunately, we have the mini grid regulation that allows for private sector participation in the off-grid space, and also allows for necessary compensation where the national grid or the utility extends the national grid to that mini grid community. If not, the provision of compensation, it allows for interconnection between the two, the national grid or the mini grid. It's important to have such regulations in place for that aspect. And I think a second challenge also is to do with access to data as well. Really understanding what the demand is, having that data readily available for commercial financiers or even international financial institutions, the World Bank and the likes. This can be a challenge in securing sufficient funding. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anita. I was starting again with you, just so that you have the opportunity to answer it the first time round.
Thank you.
We've now looked at let's call it the challenges. On the positive side of things, there's a lot of things that's happening that's successful, and we all understand that there will always be challenges. But it's always good to understand that there's been opportunities that's been successful as well. So when we look at these successful strategies or successful opportunities, I know it's probably going to touch very closely to what we've discussed now on the negative side. It's just the positive thereof. But is there anything you would like to add as successful strategies or factors that have resulted in successful infrastructure development projects? And again, it would be great if we can have an example or two.
Sure. Embarking upon public-private partnerships, that has been a very essential strategy for infrastructure developments, in particular in the private sector, in the power space. As we know, many of our African governments, obviously don't have the funding. Not to say they don't have technical expertise, but they could do with some technical expertise from the private sector as well that will bring about innovation. We found that through not just your typical EPC contract, but through the provision of subsidies, so grant subsidies to private sector from government, this goes a long way in making some of the not so attractive projects, especially when you're dealing with rural communities, a bit more attractive. And so it's important for government to take the steps in providing for the legal framework that allows for public-private partnerships and private sector investment. It's important that government provides sufficient, well, not be sufficient funding, but some sort of incentive, right, to attract private sector investment and participation. And then what else would I say is a really important strategy? Stakeholder engagement as well, because you can go as far as implementing a laudable project, but if you don't engage them from grassroots, for example, even the beneficiary communities, they can sabotage your projects because they're not well informed. So a strategy for us is key stakeholder management, ensuring that the beneficiaries are well informed and they're bought into the idea, and also in engaging the various ministries, agencies, and government regulatory bodies towards getting all the necessary approvals, permits, licenses, etc., in order to allow for such infrastructure projects to be implemented within a good time frame. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anita. Just before going on to Tim with the same question, just a quick reminder that if there's any questions, just ask them in the chat box, please. Tim, anything you would like to add on the positive side of things?
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, we've already named kind of a list of mitigants that can work, and there is examples for each of them. So, for instance, if we start with Project PrEP, there's the famous Kigali Bulk Water Project, PPP, in Rwanda, where we've seen the project benefit from extensive project preparation process involving different stakeholders on the financing side, as well as on the side of local officials. We've seen something similar in Uganda's Get Fit program, the feed-in tariff program, where the government established kind of strict rules guiding site selection, which included, for instance, in this case, maximum distance from the grid, which simplified the processes for investors. And then moving on to another mitigant that we've talked about, guarantees. So, for instance, MIGA guarantees against political risk. We've seen them in place and enabling in Zambia's scaling solar program, where such guarantees were used. I'll just leave it here. Kind of leave a little bit for the participants.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim. Ashwin?
Thanks, Wilco. So, I mean, I think I will touch on 2 points here. The first, I think both of them already been touched on slightly. So the first is around sector reforms. In order to support the private sector investing capital, one needs to achieve certain reforms in certain sectors to make an environment which is healthy and conducive for the private sector to take risk effectively. And I mean, we've seen this quite a lot in the energy sector, and one of the key things is, for example, implementing cost-reflective tariffs in the energy sector. And obviously, something which is politically quite unpopular, but it's one of those things that has to be done in order to get your utility onto a secure footing. And another element linked to that is around improving collection rates. So, for example, introducing prepaid electricity meters for everyone, the utility to actually then achieve a much higher collection rate. And I mean, a good example here, I think, is Malawi, where they've gone through a significant sector reform over the last few years, starting with implementation of prepaid meters. And in fact, they rolled it out at government level first, so to really kind of show their commitment before they required, the mass population to actually switch to prepaid meters. So that I think is a really key element in terms of, sorting out some of the challenges, sector reform. The next one I want to touch on is links to what Tim has already mentioned, and that was around scaling solar and Get Fit. Now, I think the key thing here is actually around the replicability of a program. So, I think in South Africa, we started off with the Renewable Energy IPP program, which has had 4 rounds of auction process, and that created a level of certainty and confidence for investors to come into the country and invest, set up shop, commit resources and time and effort, because they knew there was some level of certainty. And I think that what the IFC has done with scaling solar is very much leveraging off the renewable IPP program in South Africa, and similarly, the Get Fit program I think has done the same. So, like I said, I think that the certainty and the replicability is definitely key. And then, of course, as Tim mentioned, the support that was provided by the multilaterals to enhance and, let's say, reduce the risk to the private sector and enhance the bankability of the projects. That was definitely a key factor as well. But I'm going to put my second point down to program replicability. Thanks, Wilco.
Scott, you're looking at things slightly differently. You look at things from both a technical point of view and investing in it as well. So what would you like to add to this?
I think a couple of comments that were made talked around the risks and guarantees, and the risk alignment. I mean, of when we talk about the intersection between the public and private, the risk alignment to those that are best positioned to manage them and guarantee them to make them bankable. And that the REIT program in South Africa for energy was a very good example. And my takeaway from that was allowing private capital and private creativity to enter the market to provide solutions. And when we bring that into Anita's first point about the legal frameworks, And again, the aspects beyond just energy, it is an enabling factor when those legal frameworks are effectively tools for all parties to use to find creative solutions to problems that were potentially not known when the tools were created. So expanding them beyond just application to energy and acknowledging that exact same framework that was used in the REAP program is a model that can be applied in other areas. So water treatment is an area that I'm very close to in understanding that where you have a PPA or a power purchasing agreement, you can apply the exact same thing to water. It has a different technical aspect to it, but the business model and the opportunity model can be the same. So where you sell power on a dollar per kilowatt basis, you can do the same thing selling a water treatment solution on a dollar per liter of water treated basis. And I think the broad range that I mentioned, it also does talk to understanding the broad range of goals that we have. So the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 offer a number of different areas of focus, and by crafting the tools in a way that allows the users to cross-pollinate between them is where we really find big opportunities for upside realization when you can work between focus areas. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, as Anita said, in providing the tools to solve unknown problems in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Dr. Pillay, on your side?
Thank you. I think from a strategic level, the African Union Development Agency has led the process on the continent, particularly from the early stage project preparation. So you asked the question, what were the strategic elements that were successful? Now, there were quite a few projects like the Lesotho-Botswana Transfer Project, the East Africa-Uganda Roads Project, and obviously Luberizi-Kamanyola road projects in East Africa. Now, these projects are continental projects. Many countries are involved. And one of the success factors here is, do you have an implementing agency that can come together and work consistently with the different agencies that are providing support? So that's one important factor. The other is whether the countries themselves have a participation agreement or a cooperation agreement that allows for critical decisions to be made timeously. And that's now an important factor number 2 in our process. And thirdly, I think what Outer NEPAD has done successfully, it put in place this quick check methodology where it's able to assess the gaps in these projects, fill those gaps, and assist moving the projects forward. And again, many of my colleagues talked about working consistently with different partners. And this is what strategically has happened in these projects. Other partners like the EU ISM, the Global Water Partnership, the NEPAD, IPPF, and GIZ have come in to support these projects and take them forward. So these are the important things, particularly at transboundary projects that are critical. And, because, obviously political steering is important, and AUDA does that extremely well. There are different legal regimes that are applied by different countries. But by working together, we found that in the early stage, these things can be worked through, and it makes for a good project. And I'm quite certain that these 3 projects will get to financial close sometime early next year. And obviously, some of the key risks that are identified, mitigation strategies would be put forward, and hopefully make it a little bit easier for the investors to be able to participate. So I think from that perspective, coming in strategically and supporting the project and closing the loops up front is a critical role for AUDA to continue to play. PIDA PARC 2 has just been approved by the African Union Commission, and obviously there's a number of projects that will go through this process and hopefully open up this environment for investors to come in and play the role. I think when we talk financing, much of what we need is to see African investors. The target has been set, the 5% agenda. So I think I'm looking forward to seeing how African investors are going to play and participate in this process. I'll leave it there and come back possibly later.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Pillay. Now, it's interesting how we can sometimes talk about something very quickly. We use words like projects need to be bankable. And sometimes I think it also comes down a little bit to realistic expectations. We often see developers approaching us with projects and it's 100% bankable and it's fully developed. And then once you start digging into the detail, you realize that there's a little bit of a gap between what they expect and what providers of finance are willing to go for. So these are all small things, and it's brilliant to see how you are able to bring this all together from both the technical side and also the providers of finance. I must say that's fascinating. So the next one is we've now talked about the more difficult parts and also the lessons learned and how we can bring these together. So you've got how do you remove the obstacles and how do you learn from successful ventures as well. Now, here's it's probably a little bit of an unfair question, but can the implementation of these type of strategies be applied across the board on the continent, or is there some things that needs to be customized? I have to assume from where we are sitting, just from a legal framework, there will be certain requirements that you won't be able to just copy and paste all over the continent the exact same solution. Dr. Pillay, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, certainly I think one size is not going to fit all. We have to have unique strategies. Certainly when you look at where urbanization is going, how the corridors are going to be positioned as economic hubs, and what infrastructure is going to be required. So, when you look at the continent, you've got to look at these different corridors and what type of infrastructure is going to play a catalytic role in there. And I think some strategic choices have to be made. Certainly, I think there are certain instruments, like I mentioned, the service delivery mechanism would be a useful instrument to build on. It can work in many instances. I think that the guarantee mechanism needs to be more robust in its outlook. It needs to look at some of the risks that we talked about earlier, the offtake risks, and to what extent that can be effectively mitigated. I also think that as we move into this new area of climate financing, we need to reimagine the roles of our development finance institutions on the continent. Much of their roles in more recent times has been on the borderline of commercial, competing with commercial institutions. And I think, one needs to reimagine how those risks within these organizations can be recalibrated so that they can absorb higher levels of risks and allow private sector to participate. I also think there's a role for them to get into markets where it's not working and play a role in making it work, in providing policy harmonization kind of support, looking at PPP harmonization across various countries. And at the same time, I mentioned earlier, to what extent, you can get local projects within the corridor working. And I think there needs to be an emphasis there, particularly from a funding point of view. I think many of the large funders are thinking very big and the huge trans-border projects, but I think sometimes these smaller projects have a bigger impact. One of the critical strategies is to what extent we can get SMMEs involved in infrastructure. And, my hope is that, in Africa, we could have the sovereign governments come together and provide an equity fund that could come up and take some of these upfront risks. And I think it will change the financing patterns of many of the investors across Africa. And I think it's a possibility. And I think it will send out a very clear message of the various participating governments and the intentions. Let me leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pillay. Scott, anything from your side?
Yep, there was a couple of interesting points that were made there. And the last one on the scale of the projects and how to bring in the smaller projects into the conversation. I think there's a lot of opportunity to acknowledge that those smaller projects may not support a due diligence exercise to make them a non-recourse conversation. And that's where the private industry holds the key to moving forward. And the private industry, in its capacity to both take on a technical risk and finance, so the capital to execute, as well as owning the technical risk and putting up the guarantee that Tim was referring to earlier. And one of the ways in which we do that, and to demonstrate it across not just the private source of funding and the client or the government, but all of the stakeholders to make it a holistic contract, is when we work through the full life cycle in the digital business twinning scenario modeling, so that all stakeholders are participating, and migrate that into a smart contract, which again can acknowledge the technical risks and the financial and environmental all into a performance-linked remuneration scenario. So that is one of the mechanisms to remove scale from the conversation, in applying that across the board and allowing the people best positioned to own the risks and provide the capital to participate. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Azwin.
So, I mean, Morgan started off saying he didn't think it was possible to apply the same strategy across the continent. And of course, while he and Scott were talking, I gave it a bit more thought. And I think the Scaling Solar program perhaps, proves that idea wrong, being a little bit controversial maybe. But, here, the IFC has created an auction program. They implemented it in Zambia. They then took it on the road and went to Senegal. They've taken it to Ethiopia, where they've run it twice. Next stop, Madagascar, who knows? I recently saw an article where there are a number of other countries now on the list. So perhaps it is possible to implement, the strategy across the continent. Of course, the reality is a lot more complex than that. And I mean, we all know that. So, the IFC has clearly done a lot of work with those participating governments to get to a point where the auction process was indeed replicable in different markets. But I guess it does pose an interesting alternative that with participation and work from both sides, from multilaterals, from government, it is possible to put something together which maybe is more easily implementable and replicable in different markets. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting example, that Azwin. So I think they've managed to de-risk it a bit, and therefore they were able to make it work. But it's a very, very interesting point. Tim.
Thanks. To jump right in there with examples like Scaling Solar. I think ultimately, obviously, there's a point where documentation programs won't be perfect or equally perfect for every market. But there is also a point where the fact that this documentation exists, centralized, that we have a somewhat uniform program, can, even though if not perfect for every market, significantly reduce the costs when implementing these projects, when preparing these projects. And obviously, programs like Scaling Solar build up a brand, they build up investor confidence. And I think the fact that projects are part of such an initiative can lower perceived risks and increase investor confidence. And then kind of moving on to another kind of potential that I see for proving replicability across different markets. I think it's an important role that regional institutions can hold, where they bundle capacity and they facilitate the application of lessons learned across markets, and that's especially in the project preparation space. So we have these different project prep facilities like the NIPAD PF, we have the SADC PPDF, and obviously if such capacity and knowledge of different markets experienced across markets is bundled in such organizations and institutions that can help when applying them across market. Thank you very much.
Tim, sorry, just before we move off, I'm not sure, maybe you have answered this, just before we move on to Anita, but what alternatives do governments have where traditional risk mitigation instruments are not available?
Well, obviously at the end, there's always the bundle option, right? So there's the bundle option that we know from Chinese, for instance, where if a government is particularly keen on implementing a project, even the risks are high, and other traditional financing sources are not available. We have seen Chinese finance projects being successfully implemented across the continent, and we see that not only done by Chinese lenders, financiers, and contractors, but we see examples with French support, for instance, particularly in West Africa. We see where a Turkish Export Credit Agency is supporting the construction of the Tanzanian Railway, Stenagate Railway, ultimately built by a Turkish contractor, Yapı Kredi. So ultimately, that is also an option where perceived risks are so high.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Sorry for that curveball.
No.
Anita, sorry, let's go back to the previous question before me throwing a curveball to Tim.
Okay, so my answer is yes. Such strategies can be applied across the board on the continent. Essentially, what is required is that political will. And Ashwin mentioned earlier the need for significant reform as well. So with that political will come reform of the various sectors. So for example, if you want to allow for private sector investment in the off-grid space, the off-grid power space, there may be need for you to privatize your sector. For example, in Nigeria, we have the Electric Power Sector Reform Act that allowed for the privatization of the power sector and allowed for private companies to partake in the generation and distribution of power supply. So that political will, significant reform or transformation of those sectors. And also just providing another example, as a member of the advisory board on Sustainable Energy for All's Universal Energy Facility, this is where subsidies are being provided to mini-grid developers to develop mini-grids across Madagascar, Sierra Leone, and the Republic of Benin. And this program essentially was mirrored against the Nigeria Electrification Project, which I currently head. And this is where we provide subsidies on a performance-based or results-based financing sort of structure for companies who are interested in the business of providing access to power in rural communities. Because of the success of the Nigeria Electrification Project so far, in Nigeria, this was a program that was picked up by Sustainable Energy for All, and they've been able to secure sufficient funding. As I mentioned earlier, we've secured $550 million to support private sector in embarking upon mini-grid projects, as well as deploying solar home systems as well. Universal Energy Facility also has sufficient funding as well across an additional 3 other African countries. And it's going well so far. So yeah, political will and reform that allows for that enabling environment for necessary private sector participation and investment in infrastructure projects. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Anita. So we're in the home stretch now. Things have really gone quickly. So where do you see the greatest opportunities in removing the hurdles in order to unlock infrastructure development and enable development? Anita, sorry, again, you.
And I guess I feel like I keep giving the same answer for all of the questions, providing the legal framework, really. That's the beginning of it all. That's what will allow for investor confidence, that would allow for the promotion of private sector participation or even public-private partnership. I think it starts off with that legal framework, and that could only come about by having political will.
Thanks, Anita. Tim, your views on this?
Yeah. I'll kind of go back to how government strategy must respond to the project pipeline quality profile, the first point that I made today. And I think it's crucial that governments ultimately pitch the right projects to the right people. There's only so much you can do when a project is just not going to generate that revenue that makes it attractive for private investors in terms of pitching it to private investors. And I think ultimately it's important that when we look at a pipeline, when we do project prep, when we try and attract investment, we look at the right funding sources, financing sources for the correct projects. And I think as a second point, ultimately, I think a track record of policy continuity, certain kind of stability in the infrastructure space is something that will continue to support interest. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Ashwin, your views on this, please.
I think what the opportunities probably center around bankability, let's say, and we've already spoken about projects being bankable and what does that mean. Well, perhaps there are alternative financing tools which have a different threshold of bankability. So maybe we need to start exploring, more intensively those alternative sources of funding. And there I'm talking about things like crowdfunding, green bonds or project bonds, perhaps, things like bridge financing to get a project through the construction phase, where a large amount of risk resides, and then present a de-risked operational project to the project finance market for a refinancing. So maybe that's where some opportunity lies, and where we have sort of tools that we can leverage to change our perceptions on risk and what is possible with various sources of financing. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Ashwin. Scott, your views on this?
Very similar. I think the enabling environment is a big factor, and the tools and frameworks, not just for governments or not just for the private industry, but for any stakeholder to initiate solutions to create value, or rather to create a net social good, is really what is needed. And along with that, the flexibility to be able to change and realize an upside beyond what was envisaged at financial close. So, I mean, looking at the span of a contract that's like maybe 20 years, an upside that is needs to be allowed for would be to create a legacy business models for host communities that outlast that contractual relationship. And I think there's a lot of secondary upsides that can be realized if the tools and the frameworks are designed in a way that allows that. So there's a lot of opportunity, and things are evolving in a way that is bringing it to the forefront. So it's exciting times. Thank you.
Brilliant, Scott. I have to agree with you. Very exciting times ahead. Dr. Pillay, your views on this, please.
I think 4 points I think would be useful for the continent. One is to get asymmetry of data, particularly to know where trade flows are, payment patterns, and so on. So that's easily available for investors to make a decision. At the moment, there are many processes, but all of that data needs to come together so that we can get access to it easily and make decisions. I mentioned earlier the need for equity. I think the member states within the African continent need to think about having their own equity for some of the critical projects. And that must be the key driver to attract private funding. Some years ago, Outer NEPAD launched the Continental Business Network. I think it's high time that it gets a shot in the arm and starts to work, because that's the platform that can create the collaboration between where projects are being developed and how it's being pitched to various private parties and to bring them to market. And I think making that work effective is I think going to be quite instrumental moving forward. And then lastly, I mentioned earlier the way in which we deal with climate, the way in which we deal with urbanization, and how we bring that to bear in the particular corridor is going to be becoming increasingly important for investments. And I think many of the investment decisions are going to be made along those lines, provided the projects give the right returns, etc. But it has to be holistic. Would like to see development spread and the leakages of development spread throughout the corridor. So let me leave it there. Maybe there's an opportunity to come back.
Yeah, I'm afraid we had too much fun already, Dr. Pillay. Let me just use this opportunity to thank each and every one of you. Dr. Pillay, Anita, Tim, Ashwin, Scott, thank you very much. I've found this very, very interesting. I've been in this environment for quite some time, and every time that I speak to experts like yourself, I learn a lot. So from where I'm sitting, this was great. Thank you very, very much for your time. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. very much.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.